So we're in Deuteronomy chapter 34 this morning. And for those of you who are visiting with us, it's probably going to feel like you're tuning in to a TV show only to discover that it's the series finale. Because we've been working through the book of Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy chapter 34 is the last chapter of the book. But don't worry. I will do my best to make sure you aren't completely lost. Let me just read Deuteronomy chapter 34 to begin. It's a short little section, just 12 verses. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, and Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain that is in the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him, and he did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent to him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. So, imagine, if you will, sort of the greatest leader that our nation has ever known. I don't know who you would put in that place in your mind. But then imagine that he has not been a leader in our nation for 2 or 4 or 8 or 10, but for 40 plus years. We have been able to follow him, to trust him, to see that God has sort of given him a wisdom that is unlike most other people's, and has given him leadership abilities that are beyond what other people seem to possess. And then all of a sudden, he or she is gone. What do? I think instinctively we worry. We wonder, what will the future be like? What is our life going to be like now that we no longer have this person to sort of look to as a source of strength and somebody who we can trust to guide us in the way that is good and right? And that's really what the people of Israel were facing in this very moment. That Moses, their great leader, the one whom God had used to bring them out of Egypt, the one whom God had used to part the Red Sea, lead them through the wilderness, do all the things that we've talked about in the book of Deuteronomy, he's gone now. He's died. It's time to move on. And we might be thinking to ourselves, if we're putting ourselves in their shoes, but there's never going to be somebody like Moses, is there? Well, Joshua, he's a nice guy, bless his heart, but he ain't no Moses. No offense, Joshua. But, you're not Joshua, are you? Tyler, your brother Joshua. No offense to him. I realized that in the moment. Sorry. I'll buy you a candy bar or something afterwards. Anyway, Joshua's not going to be Moses. In fact, he's barely even mentioned in here. And even when he is mentioned, what's really mentioned about him is, oh yeah, by the way, Moses is the one who laid his hands on him, and we're really still focusing on Moses. There really will never be another Moses, but the people of Israel don't have to worry. They don't have to be afraid because they still have God. And in fact, in this little short chapter, these 12 little verses, as much as Moses' name is mentioned in these verses, underlying all of it, all of what we would think about in terms of Moses and his greatness, underlying all of it is God. God's enabling, God's leading, God's calling, God's direction, all of it. Our focus is still where it hopefully has always been. If we are the people of Israel, as much as we love the fact that Moses has been our trusted leader for these long and many years, what has not changed after his death is that God is still in control. And so, the first thing that we can do as we look at Moses' death, if we are sort of imagining ourselves in these people's positions, is we can still believe God. And we can still trust God. Just as was promised at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 32, Moses was in fact taken up on top of this mountain so that he could overlook the promised land, the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the land that he was not able to go into. He was able to sort of survey the land from up there, as this chapter kind of gives it. He's looking this sort of counterclockwise survey across the land from north to south. And even though he could not see all of it, it's sort of representative of what he's able to see from this sort of high vantage point on top of this mountain there, just on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And the significance was that this land that he was looking on was in fact this land that, well, what we see here, God swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give their offspring. He said it to Abraham. You can go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 13, Genesis chapter 15. Multiple times God told Abraham, before Abraham even had any descendants, that I'm going to give you this land, and it's going to be a land for your people, for your descendants. And then Isaac, Abraham's son, in Genesis chapter 26, God restates this promise to Isaac. The same thing. This land that I promised to your father Abraham, I am going to give to your descendants. And then in Genesis chapter 28, to Jacob, Isaac's son Jacob, God says again to him, this land that I promised to Abraham and to Isaac, I am going to give to you, Jacob, and your descendants. This was also the exact same, worded in the exact same way, the exact promise that God had made to Moses when he commanded Moses to leave Mount Sinai. After God had given the people of Israel the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai, and it was time for them to leave, Exodus chapter 33 verse 1 says this, the Lord said to Moses, depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. The promise at the end of Deuteronomy 34, as Moses is on top of this mountain, is basically God saying, remember what I said to you when we were at Mount Sinai? here it is. They're at the land. They're ready to go in. I promised it to you. I promised it to Abraham. I promised it to Isaac. I promised it to Jacob. Here it is. This is more, though, than a token gesture for Moses. If we were back in the ancient Near East, this was a way that this was sort of like the final signature on a contract. Before property became yours, you had to set your eyes on it. You always viewed what you were going to possess first. It didn't matter if it was far away or if it was close. You went and you looked at it. There was no internet. There was no Zillow where you could sort of get on there and look at the pictures of the houses, and you could sort of say, okay, call up a realtor in that area and be like, hey, could you go check out this house for me? I'm thinking about buying it. There was none of that. You went with your eyes, you looked at it, and you said, okay, I like it, I'll take it. That was sort of the final signature of the contract. And so God is essentially taking Moses up as a representative of the people who descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and said, all right, put your eyes on this land. It's about to be yours. The message is clear. The covenant promises are being fulfilled. Remember that promise that God made beginning with Abraham, it involved this land, it involved a people that were going to be great and numerous, and it involved a blessing. And so at this point, the nation of Israel is growing and growing. Her numbers are increasing. She is becoming this great nation. And now the land is about to be theirs, which means that they can have confidence in all of God's other promises. This promise that God had made literally hundreds of years earlier is being fulfilled. We can have the same confidence when we go to the Old Testament, even when we go to a book like Deuteronomy that's really, 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 really old. And we can read these words, we can still have confidence because it's about the same God. The same God that Abraham worshipped and Isaac worshipped and Jacob worshipped and Moses worshipped is the same God that we worship. And so when we see him being faithful to fulfill his promises, being capable of fulfilling sort of these great and grand promises, that gives us confidence that he can be believed. We can trust him. Paul even says in 1 Corinthians that these things that were written long ago were written for your benefit, were written for our benefit. Deuteronomy chapter 34 is written for our benefit. Whether you are a direct descendant from the nation of Israel or you are a Gentile, it doesn't matter. We can have confidence in the promises of God. So, for example, if we were an Israelite, and we moved into, say, the book of 2 Samuel, when God says in chapter 7 to David, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. We can be confident that that promise will be fulfilled. When Jesus in John chapter 14 verse 2 says, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. Or would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. We can believe that that promise will come true. It will be fulfilled. This also helps God's people realize that things that are yet to come, that have been promised by God, will be fulfilled. We can believe God for those things. We can trust God that they will come to pass. So in Matthew chapter 24, when Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning the day and the hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be with the coming of the Son of Man. We don't know when this time is going to be that heaven and earth will pass away. But God knows. 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter says, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief. And when the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and all its works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to live in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Do we know when that day will come? No. But we can have every confidence that it will happen because God has promised it to us. That's why when we talk about hope, and we hope in things yet to come, it doesn't mean we're sort of just crossing our fingers and we're looking for a shooting star that we can wish on. It's not like we need a little Jiminy Cricket next to us. Hope is a confident assurance in things yet to come. Just because they haven't actually happened yet doesn't mean we can't have confidence that they are in fact true and will in fact happen. Because our confidence is based on the promises of God. And he has proven himself time and time again to be a God who does not lie and who is capable of fulfilling his promises. So at the time of Moses' death, the people of God have no reason to fear, and they have every reason to continue to trust and believe God because he has proven himself to be the God who keeps his promises. Moses is dead, but you can still believe God. Moses is dead, but you can still worship God. Who wrote Deuteronomy 34? That's the big question. I mean, when somebody says, oh, I'm reading the book of Deuteronomy, if anybody knows anything about it, they're always like, well, who do you think wrote the last chapter? Because Moses is supposedly the author, right? In fact, of all the discussions, the content of the last chapter almost gets lost in the debates and discussions about who wrote this last chapter. Maybe the most debated issue in the whole book. Deuteronomy was written by Moses, but Deuteronomy 34 deals with his death and events after his death. So there's really two possibilities that make sense to me. Number one, it's possible that Moses wrote this prophetically. He was looking to the future about things that were yet to happen, and he wrote them in the past tense, knowing that this is how they would come about. Because God had revealed it to him. The God who always keeps his promises revealed these things prior to Moses' death, so Moses had every confidence that he could write them in the past tense, and they would come to pass exactly as God described them. That's one possibility. The other possibility that makes sense to me is that this last chapter is written by the author of the book of Joshua. And I would say that's a possibility because if you just turn over one page to Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, it starts off after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord. So it picks up right where Deuteronomy chapter 34 ends. So it could almost be viewed as a continuation of the narrative of Deuteronomy. Those are the two best options that I have. I don't know which one it is, but those are the ones that make the most sense to me. But another issue that's debated in the book of Deuteronomy, related to Deuteronomy chapter 34, is the burial of Moses. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 6, we read this: "And he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day." So this is very interesting. He buried him. Some, even very conservative scholars, commentators, are very reluctant to believe that this means God buried Moses. They kind of say, well, it had to be like a small group of men that were sort of sworn to secrecy. They weren't going to tell anybody what they had done. They were like the special forces of burying people. I don't know. I don't have any problem with God burying Moses. One, if you don't believe it happened that way, then verse 6 is almost rendered nonsensical. Doesn't make any sense. And if we can believe that God delivered the Israelites by the hand of Moses through the 10 plagues, and if we can believe that God, through Moses, parted the Red Sea, or provided manna for people day in and day out for 40 years, or allowed them to defeat armies that were greater than and mightier than them, I really don't think it's beyond God's ability to bury somebody. Probably wasn't even that hard for him. But why was it necessary to bury Moses in secret? If you've ever read Deuteronomy chapter 34, I wonder if you've ever wondered that. Why couldn't they know where he was? You know, how many of you have relatives that every so often you like to go visit their grave, put some flowers there, or just sort of maybe on their birthday or an anniversary or something like that? Wouldn't it have been nice for the people to just kind of go, say hey to Moses every now and then? Go visit his gravesite. That would have been nice. But I think there's really two things going on here. One, there would have been a really strong temptation for the people to dig that body up and bring it into the land with them. They did that with Joseph. Joseph's body got moved after his death and brought into the land. That's what he wanted. But even more significant than that would have been a problem because God had forbidden Moses from being brought into the land and entering the land. The bigger problem was it would have been really hard for the people of Israel, if they knew where Moses' body was, to not set up some sort of shrine to start worshiping this guy. It would have been the golden calf 2.0. This is the guy that brought us from Egypt to the promised land. This is the guy that did all that stuff. Hey, remember when we were getting bitten by those snakes and he held up that serpent? Remember that? Remember when we didn't like manna? So he asked the Lord to provide meat for us. We got all those pigeons. It didn't work out so well for us, but at least he tried, man. He really was up. He was going to bat for us. Remember that guy, Moses? Oh, yeah. And it would have become sort of like building him up in their minds. Idolatry was going to be their great temptation. The thing that they would run to again and again and again, and that God would have to correct them again and again and again for. And this would have been just another opportunity to take a man that God had used in a very unique and special way in their lives and elevate him into somebody that we can now worship after his death. We worship God not the human leaders God uses to accomplish his purpose. I thank the Lord for the people that God uses in my life, and I'm sure you do too. I thank the Lord for being able to sort of look around the world, and there are these individuals that God has placed in very strategic places or given very unique gifts that allows them to do things and communicate in ways that are beyond my abilities. But I can also look around and see how easy it is for people to elevate them into a type of person that we worship. I mean, we sometimes talk about celebrity pastors. And we've got these individuals that maybe without us even really noticing, we have come to sort of idolize. We have come to sort of worship. Maybe not even through them soliciting it all, but they're just up there doing what God has called them to do and what God has given them the ability to do. And we just think it's so great that maybe we should become their little fanboys and fangirls. And without knowing it, we start worshiping them. And nobody can say anything against them or correct them without us taking it personal and us going to bat for them on Twitter and doing whatever. This isn't anything new. Paul had to address it with the Corinthian church. People that were saying, oh, I'm of Paul, and I'm of Apollos, and I'm of Peter. And, they were sort of picking their favorite apostle or disciple. People of Israel, after Moses died, needed to remember that their worship was to be directed at God and God alone. And so I do believe this burial of Moses, aside from it being a special thing that relays sort of the unique relationship that God and Moses had, was a way for him to sort of protect the people of Israel from having yet another thing that they could elevate into this idol that they worshiped. Better for them to not even know where his body is at. Moses is dead, but we can still trust God, we still worship God, and we can still follow God. There was nobody like Moses. The Bible even says that. His boldness before Pharaoh in Egypt, he was uniquely gifted by God to do that. His leadership and mighty deeds, Deuteronomy 34 mentions, before the people of Israel. I've mentioned a few of them, like parting the Red Sea. Even people who know nothing about the Bible typically know about Moses parting the Red Sea. Maybe because they saw the Charlton Heston movie that used to sort of be on TV every year. But they know about David and Goliath, and they know about Moses and the Red Sea. Maybe Daniel and the lion's den. But there's these sort of iconic moments in his life that we who even weren't there have these sort of almost vivid mental pictures of. We kind of imagine what it would have been like. Even though he was reluctant at the burning bush when God called him and didn't really want to go before Pharaoh, and he said, well, I'll send Aaron with you. He'll help you out. He still did. Even though he didn't want to lead Israel when their hearts were hardened and they continued to grumble and complain, and he wanted to just sort of be done with it all. And God's, basically said, look, the problem is not with you. They have a problem with me. That's really what's wrong with them. So Moses still continued to obey God and lead the people. He did what God called him to do. Even when no one in the rest of the entire nation wanted to do it, he still did it. Whoever came after Moses was not going to be the same. They would not have had the same unique gifting that he had. They wouldn't be the same person. But that's okay. It's okay that Joshua wasn't Moses. It's okay that he had different abilities. Because it wasn't Moses that the people were ultimately being led by. And it wouldn't be Joshua ultimately that they were being led by. It was God. God, not Moses, was Israel's true leader. The same for us today. I'm count it a privilege to be able to be a pastor in this church and to come in and week out and to proclaim God's truth to you and to be a part of leading this congregation. But I hope and pray you don't worship me. I know enough about myself that that's probably not even crossed your mind. Okay? But even if it has, please don't do that. I am not your leader. God is our leader. Think about this. This is in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died. So another king who had led Israel in a time of prosperity. He died. And so it's kind of the same situation. What's going to happen now? We've got a great leader who's dead. Who's going to follow after him? Who's going to replace him? Who's going to do what he can do? Nobody can do what he can do. He's so great. He was so amazing. We're helpless without him. In the year that King Uzziah died, this was Isaiah. He said, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. And above him stood the seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, with 2 he flew, and one called to another, saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. This is a reminder to Isaiah that, yes, King Uzziah has died. But you know what? God is still sitting on his throne. He is still holy, and the whole world is still filled with his glory. That hasn't changed. Nothing can change. Yes, you're going to have a new leader. They were fortunate enough that Joshua was a good leader. He's going to be different than Moses. It's okay. When I was at the Master's Seminary has a very, and when I say very, I mean very rigid formula for how you are supposed to prepare and preach sermons. They have their way that they teach you how to preach. And while you're there, you have to do it that way. You cannot diverge from the formula. While you are there, that is how you write your sermons. And they'll tell you, you don't have to do this for the rest of your life, but while you're here, this is how you're going to do it. And there's always somebody who says, well, John MacArthur doesn't preach his sermons that way. And they always respond the same way. Well, you're not John MacArthur. Thank goodness we were not all John MacArthurs. As much as God has used him and many other men like him throughout church history, these human leaders, Moses included, are just instruments in God's hands as he leads his people and brings about his redemption of sinners and his restoration of creation. That's the thing that the people of Israel were supposed to take away from this. Yes, Moses is dead. Yes, you're going to have a new leader, but that's okay because you still have the same spiritual leader, The same God who rules and reigns over his creation, the same God who has created and sustains everything, the same God who was holy still remains holy. Whether you have a good leader or a bad earthly leader, the one who you should be most concerned about is God, who still is ruling over everything. You still follow him. This is the takeaway that I hope, I shouldn't even need to spell it out, but I hope you can see where this applies very directly to our lives. We fret and we worry about whenever elections roll around. Who's going to be in the Senate? Who's going to be president? Who's going to be this person? Who's going to be that person? What if it's not the person I want? God is still ruling and reigning. God is still accomplishing his purposes. God is still capable. God is still the God who is able to not only promise, but to deliver on his promises. It might not be on our timeline. It might not be even in our lifetimes, some of these things. But we can be certain that God is in control, God is still accomplishing his purposes, and that everything that he promised will come to pass. So that's so freeing for us. We don't have to worry about who's on this political group, or who's in charge of this thing. We don't have to worry about when a leader in a church or institution dies or is replaced, what's going to happen now that this person is no longer in that position. We can trust God, we can believe him, we can follow him, we can worship him. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much for the time that we have been able to spend as we've made our way through this book. I thank you for the way that you have used Moses, or used him in a unique way, not only to lead your people in a time of transition, but also to receive the law and to establish it and explain it to them in this book. Thank you for all that we have learned as we have studied it. May we come away from it as individuals who have a deeper respect for who you are as our God and King, and a deeper desire to be obedient to you and to give glory to you in all that we do. We thank you so much for this, and it's in your name we pray. Amen.